hello and welcome to another episode of The King of Games 1992. I am, of course, Shane Koski, your host and MC for today, and I am joined here at the judges panel by two fine individuals, friends of the show. I have with me Cade Call of the Gaming Memories podcast and the illustrious Nintendo host, LP Tiger. Gentlemen, how are you doing today?
Fantastic.
I'm great.
My body is ready.
Fantastic. I love it. All right. So as the title implies, you might know why we're here. We're here for a bit of a face-off, a little bit of a matchup, a Shaolin showdown, perhaps a Red Falcon rumble, if you will. And I didn't even write that shit down. That's
top of the brain, baby.
Hot damn. Anyway, self-congratulation aside, we are in fact talking about the OG Mortal Kombat arcade cabinet versus Contra 3, the Alien Wars for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. 2 games enter, 1 game leaves. That's how it works. And if you somehow have stumbled into this episode and are not entirely familiar how this goes, let me give you the brief high-level summary here. So essentially, we are going to provide a little bit of background information about both of these games in terms of, what they are, the critical reception and sales figures, any awards or recognition that they may have received at the time, things like that. We'll give a little bit of a high-level description of what they actually are. So if for some reason you're not familiar with these games, then at least you will be dangerous enough to have a conversation about it later. And then we will jump into the back half of the conversation, which is touching on 4 fairly important categories on how we're ranking these games. And it should probably be noted that even though we are going to each give, each of these categories to one of these games, ultimately, that score basically doesn't matter. It's basically like, whose line is it anyway? The points are mostly irrelevant, because anything could happen at the end of the episode, and we may pick something that didn't win jack shit. So who knows? But in terms of those categories, we are looking at the critical reception, personal attachment, legacy, and head-to-head. And that one usually requires a little bit of clarification. It is not the ultimate determination of which one is better. Head-to-head in this case means if you were to sit down right now and had these 2 games presented to you, which one would you rather play and why? That's what we're talking about there. So, gentlemen, do you have anything else that you want to throw in here before we just jump right into this thing?
Nope. I say we dive in and sink or swim.
Fight on.
All right. Well, here we go. All right, so we're going to start things off with Mortal Kombat. For the 2 of you out there that aren't aware of what this is, it is in fact an arcade fighting game wherein your combatants, with a K, of course, travel to a mysterious island owned by the one and only Shang Tsung to compete in a martial arts tournament that will ultimately determine the fate of the entire world, or in terms of the game, the Earth Realm. So Mortal Kombat was released in arcades on October 8th of course, 1992, and then just basically every home console, handheld included, in 1993. The game was developed and published by Midway, with all of the later home releases handled largely by Acclaim. As far as critical reception and sales are concerned, typically we like to provide the game rankings aggregate scores for the games that we talk about in these tournaments. But interestingly enough, both of these games do not have one. So I guess they're on even footing in that regard. There are some contemporaneous scores for Mortal Kombat, however. There's really only 2 that I could track down that are specific to the arcade cabinet. And interestingly enough, they are both from United Kingdom sources. So we have Computer and Video Games Magazine giving it a 72%, with, strangely, Sinclair User, which was a magazine that was largely just focused on Sinclair games and machines, giving it a 69%. So not necessarily a fantastic score, but still nice nonetheless. In terms of awards and recognition, Mortal Kombat was reported to be the second most popular upright arcade cabinet by Replay in September of 1992, and then fairly quickly took the number one spot from October to November, and then actually a couple more times in the following year. It topped the Play Meter Arcade chart in December of 92, and Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it its Most Controversial Game of 93 award, which, as you know, we'll probably talk about in a little bit, is not entirely surprising. Time Magazine named it one of the top 100 greatest games of all time in 2012. And finally, in 2019, Mortal Kombat was inducted into the Strong National Museum of Play's World Video Game Hall of Fame. And last but certainly not least, we need to touch on sales figures. So the Mortal Kombat arcade cabinet was the second top grossing arcade game of summer of 1993, behind only NBA Jam. And it exceeded the, now this is, I'm going to be honest, this is a strange metric, right? This is like how people complain about how Americans measure things in anything but, like, you know, the metric system. Evidently, the way that we're going to talk about this is it exceeded the $300 million domestic box office gross of Jurassic Park, the film, which released in theaters the same year, because evidently we don't actually know the real sales figure. So that's the barometer. That's the measuring stick that we're going with is Jurassic Park.
How are arcade sales figures even, I guess, aggregated or counted? A lot of times those cabinets will get bought. I'm just wondering, they'll get bought and they'll get resold, potentially move from arcade to arcade.
Sure.
Obviously, I bet you could track down the console sales figures, but we're talking about just the arcade cabinet for 92, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that was always kind of like a dubious count anyway, because to your point, I think they are fairly difficult to get a real accurate track on. I know in some previous episodes, we've talked about there was an arcade gaming association at the time that pretty much was one of or the authority on a lot of those numbers. So that was one way that, you know, you could kind of keep track of that. I know Replay was a big name in keeping track of, you know, arcade revenue at the time. So as far as I'm aware, that's really the only way that they could track that.
Has anyone ever tracked not just the sales of the cabinets, but how many quarters, like how much money? That would be interesting if there's I'm sure there's no way to find out, but I'd wonder, like, during the hype, right? The peak of Mortal Kombat, like maybe there was less cabinets than NBA Jam, but maybe more quarters were spent, you know, potentially. I don't know. It'd be interesting if
Well, I'm sure you could probably do some rough math on that, right? Like if you figured out how many cabinets were distributed at the time and then divide the rough revenue by quarters, you could probably figure that out.
Yeah.
It'd be an interesting metric, just quarters per minute.
You don't remember that time where arcade techs had spreadsheets and they kept every single game and wrote down every single amount of quarters that were put in?
Yeah.
That didn't happen. But you know.
Well, shit. There's a clipboard somewhere at some pizza joint that's just got the numbers that we're looking for.
Somebody cared enough, I'm sure.
I'm sure there was someone out there who did it, yeah.
But I assume this figure is based upon the amount of sales, actual arcade cabinets. Is that where this is assuming we're basing this off of?
Well, if you know that it made more than 300 million, the box office gross of Jurassic Park, like where did that stat come from?
Literally from the Wikipedia page. And that's what's weird about it is they provide this number, but I could not find an actual sales figure like anywhere. So someone knew the number,
but didn't put it in there.
But didn't fucking put it, because instead they wanted to be like, yeah, Zoo's better than Jurassic Park. Okay, great.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
there you go.
You're right. America, baby.
All right. So before we jump over to the vital statistics of our competitor here, let's talk a little bit about Mortal Kombat. So I'll go ahead and kind of kick this one off. So of course we're pretty familiar with what it is. You know, it's a 2D fighting game, and the game used digitized sprites of real actors, which at the time was pretty visually impressive, and also coincidentally a reason for why a lot of parents were very concerned about the over-the-top violence that the game is known for, because in some ways it made it more real, I guess, to them, particularly the parents of 1992. And so you can't really have a discussion about Mortal Kombat without mentioning the controversy that it caused and its sort of integral role in the creation of the ESRB, right?
Right. These aren't cartoons, man. These are real people, and their necks are really getting taken out. And there's blood everywhere. Where's their blood? No game has blood except this one. At the time, I'm not sure if that's true, but like at the time, you have real humans like actually bleeding. Like that was a brand new thing. So it was very can't think of the word. Violent.
Shocking, one might say. Yeah. And I mean, of course, you're sort of like referring to that, but I think the biggest issue outside of just the relatively copious amounts of blood, because we would definitely see that topped in later years, but is the fatalities, I think, was really the big sticking point for a lot of people, because that had never been seen in really any game before, where not only are you defeating your opponent, but then if you knew how to, you could, essentially rip their head off their body and have their spine dangling, with a pool of blood on the ground or something to that effect.
That was Sub-Zero's fatality. Awesome.
Yes.
And that was the most standout thing about the game, at least for me.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And a funny thing about that, it led to that point because they said that they didn't like the dizzying mechanic in other fighting games. So they decided to put that at the end to give the winning player one more hit. And I guess it evolved into, let's tear them bitches up.
Well, and the interesting thing about that too is initially they were only ever going to have Shang Tsung have the ability to do that to the player.
Oh.
And then they decided, you know what, actually this is cool, so let's just let everybody do this.
I did not know that. That's a cool little tidbit.
Yeah.
I think the game was, you're right. I think the digitized sprites, even though it was not the first game to do it, I remember Pit Fighter and a few other games that did it, but it did it at a quality that was definitely a jump up at the time. And it was the first, in my memory, and I think probably in general, the first game that used a digitized sprites that became like a blockbuster hit and sort of pushed that graphic style to like the mainstream. Then you have the fact the fatalities, I believe, were that truly was the first game that did anything like that. I can't think of any even semi-similar mechanics that came prior to Mortal Kombat. So I think
absolutely.
And there was definitely games that had blood prior, right? Digitized graphics and blood had been around, but they hadn't they hadn't been done sort of in that combination. And then when you tack on that fatality mechanic, and fighting games were also all the jam, peak 90s fighting games in general, you have the ingredients for a mega hit that just every kid in our generation, a little bit before and after, probably has memories of Mortal Kombat. It's just, whether you played it or not, you know what it is.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, just, like anecdotally, if you think about the arcade cabinet itself, this was probably one of the first times where, a kid would roll into an arcade and you would see the artwork on the side and the front of the arcade cabinet with the actual, graphics of the actual actors that were playing these characters. And then you go play the game and they fucking actually look the same,
Yes, that's a good point. It was just like lots of things came together, and I'm surprised, back to the first part, that we don't have hard numbers, because it was such a big game. I could see like an obscure game being hard to track down certain numbers, but Mortal Kombat, I mean, it was a revolutionary in a lot of ways. I mean, I think Fatalities was probably the only truly revolutionary thing about it, but the whole package came together in a way that was just, man, it was crazy. So many good memories about Mortal Kombat, but it's a 2D fighting game that just I don't know what was the magic. It had to have just been the violence at the right time. Just that little extra blood, those fatalities, just enough to get on the mind of every soccer mom out there and in the heart of every 13-year-old and just blow up.
That's right. It's peak edgy 90s.
On top of that, I do believe that the actual controlling of the game, helped with it as well, because moves in like Street Fighter were difficult. Like I couldn't figure out how to do a Hadouken for for the life of me as a kid. They actually had a block button, so you didn't have to know to hold back, and they also had easy inputs, which were forward, high punch, forward, low punch, and the moves came out when you did them. So
that's a really good point.
Definitely.
It did not play like all the other fighting games as well. I didn't think about that, but now that you bring it up, it felt a little more stiff and slow, but not necessarily bad.
No, I mean, it was super stiff, but obviously when you push there were very, very limited amounts of moves in the game. You'll hold back when you push a button and they do their little sweep kick or whatever. But I think that really did help. Like people realize, oh, I don't have to figure out all these moves in Street Fighter. Everyone's really good. I want to play this other game that is realistic, is cool, because of blood, and you can take people's heads off, which is how
a dragon and eat somebody,
which came later. But as a kid during that time, it was super, super cool. Actually, was that Liu Kang's Mortal Kombat fatality in the first one?
Yeah.
Okay,
it was in one also.
Was it in one? The dragon eating? I thought it was the.
I'm pretty sure it is.
Too.
It's very confusing because they switched a lot of stuff.
Well, no,
around
that's actually where
versions.
the you called it a bestiality.
Is that what it's called?
Animalities, right?
Uh-oh.
That was actually
Freudian
what
slip.
caused them to put animalities into the games later, was that because there was that's one of the things, right, that I feel like we probably ought to mention also, that's a little bit of a tangent but related now that you brought that up, and that is Mortal Kombat, at least in my experience, was one of the few games that just had the most rumors swirling around about things that probably weren't true. But the developers also really listened to a lot of that stuff and leaned into it pretty hard in future iterations of Mortal Kombat, where they would actually take these rumors that absolutely were false and then tease them, and then in some cases actually implement them into the games later. And that was one of the things, is that dragon finisher, the rumor around that was that, there was animalities, and it never was the case, and then ultimately it actually became a thing.
Cool deal.
Lots of cool things about this game. I think you made a good point, Tiger, about the approachability of the gameplay. I didn't think about that, but it was easier to pick up and play than Street Fighter.
I mean, obviously, you want to play it because it looks real and all the violence or whatever. But once you start playing, you realize how easy it is. They got you. So at least that's the way I felt at the time. So
yeah, for sure. And just, I guess, one final note on this to kind of cap that off is that, having said all of this about it, keep in mind that initially this game was developed in roughly 8 months by a team of about 4 people. So,
Right.
Pretty impressive.
All
All things
cool.
considered.
Are we also going to mention the fact that it was made specifically for Jean-Claude Van Damme?
Oh, yeah. You want to talk about Universal Soldier? Sure.
Yeah. I didn't know that. So when I read that, I was like, oh, well, that makes sense, because Johnny Cage is basically Van Damme. And, apparently Johnny Cage was just JC for Jean-Claude. They named him Johnny Cage as an inspiration of Van Damme. But he was actually supposed to be in the game. But I don't know what happened. I'm sure somebody else.
So it was originally supposed to be a licensed game for Universal Soldier. And the stated reason for why it never happened was good old Jean-Claude just was too busy to be bothered with being involved with the creation of the game. And so, they decided to take the assets they had already started working on and kind of turn it into their own thing. And that's why Johnny Cage looks the way he does, because his outfit in the original Mortal Kombat is basically Jean-Claude Van Damme from Bloodsport.
Right. And then he does have the split punch, which he does in Bloodsport.
He does.
So that was really cool. But yeah, I thought that was really super cool. Oh, the one other thing was Van Damme did eventually have a game in the future. Street Fighter the movie.
Yes, which was then Street Fighter the movie, the game.
Which also used digitized sprites.
It did. Everything came full circle.
Yeah, good for him.
Game was a dumpster fire, but still. All right, I suppose we should hop on over to our other contestant in today's matchup. So let's talk a little bit about Contra 3, The Alien Wars. So, Contra 3 is a run-and-gun side-scrolling action shooter in which the player takes on the role of either Jimbo or Sully, commandos tasked with saving Earth from the evil alien Red Falcon's invasion in the year 2636. The game is also known as Super Probotector Alien Rebels in Europe, and it was released on February 28th of 1992 and was developed and published by everybody's favorite, Konami. In terms of critical reception and sales figures, we have some similarities to Mortal Kombat in that we do not have an aggregate score available, but we do have some contemporaneous ones. So Computer, or CVG rather, gave it a 91%. That was the UK-based magazine. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it a pretty solid 36 out of 40, and Famitsu gave it a middle-of-the-road-ish 28 out of 40. There were a few other ones that you can go and look up, but honestly, those are kind of the big ones. In terms of awards and recognition for Contra 3, The Alien Wars, Nintendo Power Magazine ranked it the third best game of 1992. And in conjunction with that, it was nominated for Game of the Year. Ultimately, it obviously did not win, but took third place instead. EGM ranked it the 8th best console game of all time in 1997. And unfortunately, we have even less information about actual sales figures for this cart than we did for the Mortal Kombat arcade cabinet, in that we really don't have any at all. And I went digging for this also, and the only thing I could really find was VG charts, which usually is a fairly decent resource for these sorts of things. But the only numbers that I could find were for Japanese sales, and those looked like they were possibly incomplete. So we don't actually have any solid numbers whatsoever, which, again, seems a little strange to me, considering this is not necessarily a super obscure game, and it was on a very popular home console, but there you have it.
What are the odds? 2 games with no sales figures.
Yeah, I found this to be very strange on both accounts, actually, but maybe Mortal Kombat a little bit more given its ubiquity, but at any rate, I don't know, what do you guys want to take some discussion here on Contra 3, or do you just want me to keep rolling?
I mean, it's Contra with better graphics and cool alien designs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
true. These are true.
It's if someone's listening and they don't understand what a Contra game is, it's like, I guess the
what the fuck are you doing here?
Yeah, but in case you don't, no offense, it's like run and gun. Run and gun is that's the genre, I suppose. Side-scrolling run and gun. I can't think of any other way to say it.
It's like Mario, except you got guns, and if you get hit once, you die.
Yes.
There you go. It's Mario Dark Souls. There you go.
Dark Souls Mario.
Writing that down.
I think it's a technically pretty polished game for the time. I do remember it having some slowdown issues, but a lot of games on the Super Nintendo had slowdown issues. I did go through and watch a full playthrough in preparation for this and played the first couple levels on emulator just to jog my memory. I did play it as a kid at a friend's house. Never beat it as a kid. I remember it being very difficult. It's Contra. I don't know how it's in my mind, it's the last like popular Contra before most people would argue the series took a downhill turn. I, for one, like the PS1 Legacy of War Contra, but most people don't and think it just went to shit after that. I know a lot of Contra heads consider it the pinnacle of the series.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It really stands out because of the fact that we had 3 different Contras already on the NES, and just the jump from 8-bit to 16-bit and all the extra, like they're little additions when you look at it now, but back then it was kind of big. Like they had the second weapon slot.
Yep.
And so that you could hold 2 weapons. Not only that, I have to include that my favorite thing to do when I played this game was pose. So you hold L and R and you pose. And you don't think about holding it and then using both weapons at the same time. You just like the fact that you could pose.
You get that nice sprite of these guys like 55-inch fucking chest.
And I would say just the fact that a character will face the screen or face you, like playing the game, that was really cool at the time for me. There was also, you had a bomb. In the past Contras, you had jump, you had shoot. But now you got the bomb. Now you can hang on to stuff. Oh yeah, and now you can climb onto stuff. Like, and all of that was in the first level. So like they really, I think they really came at you here. Like you remember Contra, but this is on a whole nother level.
It's the formula refined for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you said that, Tiger, because that actually kind of segues into what I was going to mention, which is right from the get-go, Contra 3 kind of hooks you with basically everything. It's got this fantastic soundtrack right from the start of level 1. It's got intense and very precise gameplay, and the action is just completely over the top. And to Cade's point, Contra 3 really did and does, I suppose, if you're still playing this on original hardware, it pushes the SNES to its limits, and the results are by and large very impressive. I think the use of Mode 7 in Contra 3 was intelligent throughout, where a lot of games it kind of used it as just a shitty gimmick. This actually leveraged it in a way that made sense and not only enhanced the gameplay, like, Tiger, you mentioned the first level just kind of comes out kicking, and you get about halfway through the first stage and you get this Mode 7 ass jet flying directly into the screen and carpet bombing the whole level. And that's just so fucking intense just right off the bat. And so you have that, but you also have this Mode 7 stuff that ends up completely changing the game with 2 overhead twin stick shooter style levels mixed in, amongst the more traditional sort of side scrolling run and gun action.
Was there only 2 top-down levels?
Yeah, there's only 2.
Okay.
Yeah. And I also want to point out that the sprite work in Contra 3 is like on another level. Yes. Even the normal enemies often end up being these huge, impressive looking sprites, but this really, really shines with the boss encounters. You get these like multi-sprite behemoths that like in many cases take up like half the whole screen. And in the sake of full, objectivity, Cade was absolutely right in that there are a number of cases, and I've played this game enough to know exactly where they are, of slowdown that will happen consistently every single time. Partially because, the developers were really trying to push the hardware and see what it could do. But also, these giant sprites coupled with the vast amount of bullets flying around, you tend to get some sections that kind of slow to a crawl. But frankly, one could argue that that's actually to the player's benefit in some cases, because it gives you a little bit more time to react.
It almost makes it feel more epic. Like movies sometimes will go into slow-mo as an aesthetic choice to sort of. And you could argue, I don't know if the developers did that on purpose. They probably didn't. But maybe
I doubt it.
It unintentionally works in a similar way. I think similar to Mortal Kombat, where we talked about the digitized sprites and the aesthetic and being realistic. The aesthetic of Contra for me was, when I was younger, graphics probably mattered more than they do now to the average player. And title screens and intros were a big deal, I think, for a lot of people. And the opening sequence to Contra, the sprite work is awesome. And then the Mode 7 scaling, and like you said, the boss sprites, I don't know if this is true, but I would be surprised if they didn't officially in some capacity take inspiration from Alien in like HR Ginger.
They absolutely did. Yeah, for sure.
It's like, I love it. The aesthetic of Contra 3 is one of those moments where the jump from generation, from the 8-bit to the 16-bit, combined with the Mode 7, the sprite work, the HR Ginger-esque aesthetic, the chaos, the climbing. It's just, when Contra 3 came out, it was like, we expected a jump, but this was a jump. It was crazy.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And just for the sake of clarity, we are referring to HR Giger as far as artwork is concerned.
My bad. Yeah. That guy, the guy that did Alien.
That dude. Yes. And so, outside of what we've already mentioned, there's also one other entire level in the game that really continues to add variety, where you have an entire section that sort of weaves in an auto-scrolling stage where you're on a hover bike, which is very akin to like the hoverboard levels in Turtles in Time. So you have an entire stage of the game that is, again, like a third play style. And so this game, even though it is relatively short, if you're decent at the game, you can play through the whole thing in under a half hour, which is fairly typical for a lot of arcade style games like this. I mean, speaking of Turtles in Time, you can finish that reliably in about 25 minutes, give or take. So not anything surprising there, but in that short amount of time, they did manage to pack a lot of variety in, for better or worse. Because in the sake of fairness, I do want to mention that the second overhead level in Contra 3 is fucking balls.
Is that the one with
it
the
sucks.
sand, like the quicksand?
Yes. It's terrible. And this is coming from someone who is like unabashedly a huge fucking fan of this game. That level sucks.
That's all right.
There is zero redeeming factors for that level.
It's not right. That's not bad. Just push the right direction.
Dude. Yeah, right. Listen, whoever thought that like narrow walkways with no guardrails coupled with these like patches of ground that cause you to speed up, slow down, or constantly spin around, that person needs to be fired. And that boss fight is trash.
Okay, yeah.
It's like
a little wild.
Visually it's cool, but the mechanics of it are awful. All right. Well,
We'll get there.
Yeah. On that note, I suppose we'll go ahead and we'll take our first break. And then once we come back from that, hopefully you'll still be here because we are going to jump right into our discussion on the four major categories and ultimately the points that we are going to assign to each game for said categories that, ultimately may or may not matter. So we will see you on the flip side. And we are back, and hopefully you are too, because this is where the discussion starts to get real down and dirty and into the weeds. So we are going to cover our four major categories that we are ranking these games on. As we said prior to the break, those are critical reception, personal attachment, legacy, and head-to-head. So we are going to kick things off with critical reception. And you know what? I'm going to throw this over to Tiger. You can go ahead and start. So Tiger, between these two games, what are your thoughts on their critical reception and which one would you give this to?
Oh boy. And we're talking, I think we're talking about critical reception that was given during that time.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Mortal Kombat was obviously one of the biggest games. When that game came out in the arcades, it was the game. Street Fighter 2 was the game to hover around when it came out, and then when Mortal Kombat came out, people hovered from Street Fighter to Mortal Kombat. It made a huge impact on arcades, absolutely. And I want to say, from what I remember, the reception was super positive for it because of. I assume it's just the general popularity of it. The fact that it was realistic characters. You have all these sprites everywhere, sprites and cartoons and whatever. But these are real people now, which wasn't done very much. Switching over to Contra 3, that was also a very positively received game. I don't really feel that it was as positive as far as, the feeling that I got from people around me or like my environment, I didn't feel the strength of the positive reception of Contra as strong as I did for Mortal Kombat. And, you know, it was mostly because it was in the news. Mortal Kombat was in the news. It was, you know, it was the big thing that, you know, got into the whole creation of the ESRB. It was just everywhere. So you couldn't really escape it. I really feel that Mortal Kombat kind of takes this one, in my opinion.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in next then, and we'll let Cade close this one out. So in terms of critical reception, yeah, I think I would have to probably agree with a lot of what Tiger already said. I mean, for Mortal Kombat, I mean, honestly, what is there to say? Like, the game was colossal. Everybody knew about it. Even if you didn't play it, you knew about it. It was everywhere, and it was by and large very, very well received. I mean, you know, in terms of the gaming community, I guess, obviously, you know, we've talked about its controversy with the violence and, you know, the ESRB being created as largely because of this game, along with a few others like Night Trap. Yeah, it was practically inescapable. Like, if you were of a certain age, even like, you know, a teen or a younger kid or preteen or what have you, hanging around at the arcades, as a lot did at the time, you obviously were going to see this. And not only were you going to see it, but you were going to see that crowd that Tiger mentioned, just hovering around it with people, you know, stacking their quarters for next to play against the person who's fucking wrecking everybody and tearing their spines out or what have you. So yeah, not too much more to say there. In terms of Contra, you know, I think the overall review scores that are known to us at the very least are all fairly high. It was very positively received in that regard. And I mean, ranking third best game of the year by Nintendo Power is also a pretty notable accolade, you know, being put up there as a possible contender for game of the year. Pretty big deal. Unfortunate that we don't have really any sales figures or data on this, but, you know, anecdotally, it must have sold fairly well, at least here in the US, because, you know, some retrospectives that you can go and read out there from various, you know, journalistic outlets and what have you, claimed that Contra 3 was in some ways practically synonymous with Super Nintendo ownership. It was just that ubiquitous. Like, if you had an SNES, there was a really good chance that you probably had Contra 3. So again, not necessarily a hard figure, but, you know, something to keep in mind, I suppose. Now, having said both of those things, it's kind of hard not to go this way, right? But I think I have to agree that in terms of just overall critical reception, MK definitely has to take this one for me. So, Cade, what do you think?
I'm going to disagree, but only because I separate, at least in my mind, critical reception, popularity, and controversy. And I think a lot of those arguments are fueled by controversy and popularity. Meaning, like, an example, some movies might have like a really high critic score, but they're like a cult classic and they didn't sell really well or sell a lot of tickets, but they're a really good movie they just never took for whatever reason.
Yeah,
I think games can, at least in my mind, I separate those things. There's no doubt that Mortal Kombat was more popular. And there's no doubt that it was a bigger part of the lexicon and the culture. And there's no doubt that it had more controversy. Look, there's no doubt in all of that. Critical reception, I mean, I don't know what the critics were saying at the time. We have a little bit of data that you pulled up in the bullet point. And we're not necessarily supposed to talk about critical reception later, only in the year. But because we have so little data, I think of like, Contra is considered the peak of the series. Mortal Kombat being the first entry is definitely not considered the peak of the series.
Right.
And I think just a lot of those arguments are all very fair that you guys both brought up, but I think the fuel for most of that is popularity and controversy. So I'm going to be the contrarian, and I'm going to go with Contra.
All right. No, I love it. I think that's a totally valid point to
absolutely
make, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, moving things right along, let's jump into personal attachment. So I'll go ahead and kick this one off. So it might not be a surprise if you've been listening to our show for any length of time and know anything about me at all, that turns out I'm not much of a fighting game fan. Probably because I'm fucking just objectively terrible at them. But just never really been much of my jam. So personal attachment to Mortal Kombat, it just really isn't much. Like, of course, I saw it at the arcades and a couple like pizza joints around my hometown, but I never really played it. Actually, I struggle to think of a time when I played the original Mortal Kombat arcade machine, because remember, we're talking about the arcade cabinet specifically. We're not talking about any of the home console ports, because that's a whole different ball game. But in terms of just the cabinet itself, I don't think I ever touched it, not even once. Honestly, it wasn't until MK2 that I actually started to care about the Mortal Kombat franchise. And I mean, that has to be tempered with that knowledge that I am not a fighting game fan. So it was more of like, I liked Mortal Kombat 2 from an aesthetic point of view, but was not good at it, let's just say. Now, Contra 3, that is an entirely different story.
It sounds like that was your jam.
I fucking love this game. Listen, I am trying to be as objective as possible through this whole episode, okay? Because that's what I'm trying to have some sort of integrity through the course of this King of Games tournament. But I fucking love this game. I played the absolute shit out of Contra 3. Everything about Contra 3 was the definition of fucking awesome to me as a kid. And frankly, it kind of still is. Like this post-apocalyptic setting with these H.R. Giger looking aliens that are honestly borderline demons at that point.
Yep.
A completely kick-ass soundtrack. The sound design was incredible. It was punchy. It felt good. These humongous bosses that to this very day look incredible. I mean, even the box art for Contra 3 is just so fucking awesome. Like I can't say enough good things about Contra 3. So obviously this has to go to Contra 3 for me. This is in my top games of all time, like bar none. So on that note, let's kick this over to Cade. So Cade, what's your personal attachment to these two titles?
I'm almost, well, man, I've been what's the word? I've been stewing on this for about a week because I knew this was coming.
Mm-hmm.
I think personal attachment narrowly goes to Mortal Kombat. I'm similar to you in the sense of I don't play fighting games. I'm not good at them also. The only fighting game that I've ever spent time trying to develop a skill at is Smash Brothers. And I'm pretty good at Smash Brothers, but that's like an entirely different formula than like the standard 2D fighting game. I'm terrible at them. I was never good at Street Fighter. I was never good at Mortal Kombat, though to Tiger's point, it was a little bit more approachable. I could actually do the moves. I could fly across the screen as Liu Kang and kick someone in the chest. It was awesome. But and then I didn't own a Super Nintendo. I was a Genesis kid, but all my friends who had a SNES, back to your point about sales, at least in my little anecdotal experience, it was ubiquitous. All my friends that had a SNES had Contra. And it was 2-player. So I had these great memories of playing Contra with my friends at their house.
Mm-hmm.
But that is just shy of the magic. And maybe it's because I have a little bit of sadness that the arcade is dead. Because the arcade was a magical wonderland. I liked it more. I went to Disneyland as a kid. If you asked me, do you want to go to the arcade or Disneyland? I would say the fucking arcade. Disneyland, Mickey can suck it. The arcade was magic. And there was just something about, even though I wasn't good at Mortal Kombat, like going there, the energy, people standing around the cabinet, like you said, the one guy that's like winning 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rounds in a row. Everyone's trying to beat him. People are screaming. They do a fatality. I'm like watching it and making sure my dad can't see me watch it because I'm not supposed to watch that game. Just the whole thing is magical. And so I know that's not related to gameplay, which that's why this was hard for me to decide. But personal attachment is more than just, I suppose, the feeling of playing the actual game. It's the whole experience of how the game impacted you. Yeah, and I would say Mortal Kombat just barely squeezes out over Contra.
The arcade was the true Magic Kingdom all along. It was more
just the magic, the energy of being in the arcade when it came out. And there was an arcade close to my house, and I think I was like, it came out in 92, right? So I would have been 6, I would have been 7. Yeah, and I could ride my bike. The arcade was pretty close. I would ride my bike to Blockbuster and rent games, and I would like save up quarters from chores and ride my bike to the local strip mall and hang out at the arcade. And lots of times I would go with no money, and I would just hang out at the arcade and watch people play. And Mortal Kombat was a game that I would sit and watch people play for hours. So it's just magical.
Awesome. All right, Tiger, what are you feeling?
Well, just that discussion, like I just want to tell you that takes me back too. It was magical for me. And like, just side note, whenever I went to Disney, I definitely wanted to stop at the arcade. Screw the rides, man. Okay, so separate to both of you, I had a huge personal attachment to both games. I'm trying to separate my Mortal Kombat console versus my arcade, but the attachment for both games were, pretty heavy. I went to the arcade often, and again, when I said, Mortal Kombat came, it was the game to go to, and I absolutely recall trying to get a chance to play the game in order to figure out how to do the moves. and I remember that the easiest person to play at the time when I was learning was Scorpion, because all you had to do was back low punch and you throw that spear, and that I'll tell you, that spear was like such a huge memory. Because, you hear them say, "Get over here." That's like, one of the quotable lines in Mortal Kombat.
Probably the most iconic move of the game, I would argue.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And, you just want to get in that uppercut. And that was the go-to move usually whenever you did the spear. And that was like the one that I want to do. I want to spear people, And not to mention, also the easiest fatality of the game, in my opinion. You just hold block and you just push up. And then, they catch on fire. They turn into a skeleton. I remember those moves just, one, they're simple. But two, that they're ingrained in my brain for wanting to play Mortal Kombat and wanting to do those two specific things. And I even get to the teleportation, which was, at the time, cheat as fuck, But
yes. This is probably the reason that I played Scorpion all the time too, because I was just like, I can just cheese this. That's all I'm gonna do.
And they all had cheesy. Well, most of them had cheesy things, but those moments stuck up here in my brain easily, and those were good times. So Contra 3, on the other hand. Again, as you said earlier, everyone had Contra 3. Actually, it's funny because I had a Super Nintendo. I did not have Contra 3. I had to rent it to play it. But my friend actually did. And boy, oh boy, playing that game one player, I guess as a kid was super hard. I want to say that there was a code where you could get 9 lives.
Well, I mean, you can get up to 7 just by changing the options.
Oh, okay. That's what it was. Okay, so in the options, you could change it to the higher amount. So we would just do that because, we're trying to beat the game. Me and my friend Mike, I would go over to his place and we would go at Contra 3. And it was such a hard game that we could not beat this thing. And the memory of trying to struggle through all of the levels and always hitting a point where we couldn't beat something. And I remember the hardest point at the time that I could remember was the scrolling level, the auto scrolling level. And, and I wanted to say this earlier, but, you're playing this auto scroller like, okay, we've seen auto scrollers, blah, blah, blah. They're cool, whatever. But then they tell you, hey, get on this helicopter and you're taking off in the air. You're like, oh, what the fuck?
Hell yeah.
Yeah, that was such a cool thing. But it was also super hard because you had this little grappler guy was swinging around and you didn't know what he was going to do. And then he shoots at you and you guys are on the same missile in the damn helicopter. All this was so hard. And then after that, you're flying with all these other missiles. So you're trying to hop on all these other missiles. And at the same time, you're trying to destroy the little top thing and the little bottom thing on this freaking plane in front of you or whatever this ship in front of you is. And at the same time, they're also shooting the missiles and they're blowing up. So you have to change all your missiles. Oh God. That was the hardest and most memorable stage for me as a kid. And like, I just remember having like a blast playing it. And also at the same time being super frustrated that we would die over and over and over again. And we would not be able to pass that level. And, eventually we did and, rejoiced and then realized that, oh, we have still many more hard things to do.
Yeah, I was going to say, you finally overcame that one only to be greeted with that second overhead level. The game was just like a big fuck you.
Yeah. And, I don't even remember beating it as a kid. I do remember getting to the last level and then you're just encountering all these hard, ridiculous, like kind of mini bosses. Mm-hmm. And, these times are very, very like, I can vision them very well. I see them like they made a huge impact on me. Okay, so saying both of these things, I do think that Contra 3 had more of an impact on me, and I think based on my personal attachment, I want to say that I would pick Contra 3 as the choice, being that I think. Since it was associated with like hanging out with friends, there was a co-op involved, and like just the feeling of playing video games and always like trying to struggle past a certain point, and when you pass it, like that, you just that feeling of victory, and then you overcome something. Like those are the feelings that I really love, that I loved as a child when I played a video game. So I think that's specifically why I would choose Contra 3 over Mortal Kombat.
Love it. I'm going to be honest, I am surprised by this. I was certain that you were going to pick MK.
I'm the fighting game guy, category. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
out of the three of us, Tiger's the only one that's like halfway decent at any of those games.
Well, it's surprise, this was Contra 3. But, at the same time, I will say that Mortal Kombat versus Street Fighter, I was always a Street Fighter guy. Mortal Kombat was always a kind of weird, like it wants to be a good fighting game, but it just focuses too much on the fatalities and stuff. So at least that's the way I felt about it.
No, that might be some foreshadowing. I like that you brought that up, but all right. So in that case, surprisingly, Contra is going to take the personal attachment category 2-1. So we have yet to have a sweep, which I am also actually kind of surprised about. But I love it. It's good. We got a healthy competition going on here. So moving on to our third category, which is the game's legacy. We will let Cade start with this one.
God, this is the one I've been thinking about the most. I literally was laying in bed last night, like legacy. Like how am I gonna break this down? Because it's hard, because in this whole King of Games thing, a lot of times you're pitting games that are different genres. Sometimes, in this case, a game that's the first title in a IP, and in Contra's case, the third, arguably pinnacle of the IP. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to know, like if it was Mortal Kombat versus Contra 1 in terms of legacy, I think Mortal Kombat would win. It's just a bigger title. But I mean, a long story short, it's like Mortal Kombat's a bigger franchise than Contra. If Contra hadn't died off and maintained more headspace in the collective consciousness, then there would be like a better argument. And I almost want to give it to Contra, because I think Contra is technically a better game on a technical level. But the legacy of Mortal Kombat is like, we don't have Contra movies. We don't have Contra, like Contra's done. Mortal Kombat's still around and still relevant. So, and Mortal Kombat started it. So I think it's a slam dunk, Mortal Kombat.
All right. Succinct. I like it. All right, Tiger, what do you think?
Here's my in-depth look at at choosing Mortal Kombat for legacy.
Oh, okay, great. I'll just go ahead and mark that down.
Like I agree with what Cade said. Like Contra 3, that was kind of the pinnacle. It's like it's done. Contra was great. It actually, it evolved from Rambo movies and, guns and all that whole trend. They had a nice little resurgence with Contra 4 on the DS. That was nice. Mortal Kombat, they're on number 12 almost now.
Yeah.
Still going, man. It created it, blah 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 blah. ESRB, Congress, blah blah blah, blood, save the kids, whatever, all that stuff. It made a
D.
huge
Snyder, et cetera,
such a huge impact on our culture, like the world, video games in general. I can imagine like, oh, we can have blood now. Oh shit, let's start putting blood in our games. Yeah, so like, absolutely, Mortal Kombat wins it hands down. What about you, Shane?
Well, you might be surprised, but I'm going to say. Actually, you're not going to be surprised at all. It's Mortal Kombat. I mean, come on. Like, I mean, listen, the thing is like, unfortunately, there's just not a whole lot to say in Contra 3's favor here as far as legacy is concerned. I mean, Cade, you mentioned it. I think it's the most notable item, like in terms of this game's legacy, is that by and large, Contra 3 is arguably the best game in the entire Contra series. Possibly only losing out to Contra Hardcore. There are a lot of people that consider that one to be the better game. I am not in that camp, but it is a valid argument to make. And that's kind of it. Whereas, you have Mortal Kombat, and I'm not going to sit here and reiterate what you guys said, but the legacy of this game is fucking enormous. I mean, it goes without saying that it created a monster in more ways than one, right? It kicked off an entire franchise that is still running to this day, along with feature films of dubious quality, comics, toys, merchandise. The list just goes on and on and on. So it has to go to MK for this, for sure. So that's going to be our first sweep of these categories, which then also leads us into the final one, which is head-to-head. So if you had these two games just placed right in front of you right now, and someone held a gun to your head and said, pick one, which one would you pick and why? And let's go ahead and start this one off with Tiger.
All right, so I'm in my room. And
yes.
There is a Mortal Kombat arcade machine. And
mysteriously.
A gun. And to my head. And Contra 3. Oh boy, I think it honestly it's not easy because, and I'll say only because you're talking about Mortal Kombat arcade, and just the sight of the arcade machine is enough to be like, well, that automatically makes it a little more interesting. Like just thinking about it, because I remember like when I had a Super Nintendo, I was still like, this still isn't as good as the arcade. The graphics are still not as good as the arcade. Like and I remember just having this huge desire. I wish these games were like the arcade. Either the sounds or the graphics or just the controls and the fact that you're not using a stick. Like I used to love arcade sticks, and then switching to a controller and trying to play fighting games on a controller, like it just was not the same. So
1992 first world problems.
Right. And I'm not buying the dumb little, what do you call that shit? The Super Nintendo arcade stick with the fucking 4 top buttons and the 2 bottom ones. Like, who thought of that? Come on. Anywho, so just trying to stay with it. I honestly though I do believe I have a stronger attachment, and again we talked about personal attachment. I do have a stronger attachment to Contra 3, but putting it in front of me, I do think I would probably pick Contra 3 over Mortal Kombat.
Really?
Mostly because I have stronger memories and I want to revisit those memories with Contra 3. I would say that would be the biggest reason why. I don't have any strong desires to play Mortal Kombat, especially the first one. I want to say that it's not far off, because, and then the biggest reason being that it is the arcade, and my experience with the arcade machine is very limited because of how popular it was. And by the time the newer iterations came out, I was already playing those. So I think I'll just cut it there. I definitely pick Contra 3 over Mortal Kombat.
All right. 1 point in Contra's favor. I'm going to go ahead and go next. I'm going to be very succinct. I'm not going to pontificate too much about this because, I'm just going to lead you guys on for nothing. It's fucking Contra. Like full stop. Like I could play. Like would I play Mortal Kombat if you put it in front of me? Sure, I guess. Like I'd play it for 5 minutes and be like, "Yep, I remember that's what this is," and then I'd be done. Whereas I could sit down and even though Contra 3 is like I said, a 30-minute game. If I had nothing else to do, I'd play through it multiple times. Fuck it. Like, it's just that fun of an experience. So, absolutely Contra 3. All right. Cade, what about you? Where do you stand on this?
Well, since you were so succinct, maybe I'll just be succinct too. It's also Contra 3, mainly because I'm not good at fighting games. And I just feel like the replay value on a game like Contra is better based on my personal tastes. Mm-hmm. The only fighting game, like I played a lot of Smash Brothers. I did play a lot of Killer Instinct on Nintendo 64. And once you get good at, that's the only fighting game I got good at. And once you kind of get good at it, it's like, I don't know how to explain it. Like something about side scroller platforming, I can do the same thing over and over again and find new ways to make it enjoyable. But I remember once I sort of figured out Killer Instinct, the game just wasn't fun anymore. I went from really liking it to like, ugh, don't put that game in front of me. I don't even want to touch it. So if I was stuck with one, I think I would get way more mileage out of Contra 3.
All right. Well, there you have it. So in an interesting turn of events, at least in my own mind, because I saw this going very differently, to recap our categorical discussion, we have a tie, essentially. So critical reception, that's a 2-1 given to Mortal Kombat. Personal attachment, a 2-1, but given to Contra. And then the last two categories are clean sweeps, with Legacy going solidly to Mortal Kombat, and our head-to-head going to Contra 3, The Alien Wars. So that sets us up potentially for a very interesting final verdict discussion, which we are going to get into right after we take one last break. So we will see you there. And we have returned. Here we are. We are at the final verdict, where we are going to cast our votes for which one of these behemoth titles of 1992 are going to ultimately move on to the next bracket of our King of Games 92 tournament. And we are going to start things off with our Nintendo host, LP Tiger. So Tiger, which one of these games do you think deserves to move on?
Well, since I'm the Nintendo host, obviously one of these games are only on Nintendo. So, no, okay.
Is that a vote?
No. Let's talk a little. Sure. Some of the things that I wanted to mention, but didn't really have a chance to throw in there. Mortal Kombat has so much personality. And that personality actually, like, very much meshes very well with me. And, kind of wacky, like, over the top sometimes, I'd say a lot of games were wacky as well. This game really kind of went super over the top. Obviously, it's not only is using real human life characters, but then, you're basically turning them into cartoons with what you're doing with them. And just I think it's the first time I was really like, this is real, but it's not, because you have Raiden flying horizontally with his moves. Well, back, forward, by the way. Which is super easy to do. You have Johnny Cage with his little split punch in the balls, which doesn't work on Sonya, obviously, by the way.
It's a nice touch.
Yeah. You you have Liu Kang, who's able to fly entirely across the stage with his like high kick. You just have these ridiculous moves, and it made the game, which I don't recall anyone saying, very comical. And Street Fighter wasn't like that at all. So it really separated itself in the fighting game genre, not only because of the blood and the easy inputs, but also because it was comical. And they really took that, as they went forward making more games.
Well, are you trying to tell me that people don't have 6 rib cages?
And that's another thing, right? Yeah, you do the fatality and it's just like that all. It was very funny. Yeah, all the bones, all the blood. Obviously, it was done over the top to be like hilarious. And then we have Contra 3. Contra 3 is this very. We never talked about. Well, it might have been mentioned, but like the music. You mentioned, Shane. The music in the game is freaking awesome. And then just the first stage. I remember the entire track of the first stage. When you get to the boss at the end. And then the boss breaks the wall, and it has this like eerie ding, 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 ding. And that I remember as a kid, like, holy shit, what the fuck's gonna happen? And this big like turtle bitch with mosquitoes coming out of the fucking top, and a little fucking heart that you have to shoot. And he breathes out the fucking energy or whatever. Like, and that's just one boss. Like all these bosses have this like super creative, not really my style, but like very like sci-fi, like over. Also, I would say over the top looks, like taking up the half of the screen or the whole screen. Very, very different in comparison to the previous Contras that were released. Anywho, I just feel like I'm filling the void here because I kind of want to just make it somewhat fair between both of them. But those two things that I mentioned for these games stood out for me. But obviously, if it wasn't hinted at earlier, I have such a stronger connection with Contra 3. And I'll just say it. Yeah, that's it. That's my choice. Ultimately, Contra 3 is my pick.
Holy shit. We need that like horn sound effect. Oh my God.
Meep, 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 meep. Meep, meep.
I am fucking flabbergasted that's where you went with that.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
I thought this whole thing was going to be a suite for MK.
Whoo. Oh, I cannot wait.
Y'all didn't know I liked running guns. Y'all didn't know that.
To see the reaction to this episode. Holy fuck. All right. Wow. I love it. All right, Tiger. That was fantastic. All right, Cade. You're up, man. What's your thought process on this?
My thought process is I have a stronger connection to Mortal Kombat because of the arcade stuff. I think Contra 3 is a technically better game. It's arguably the pinnacle of the series. But when trying to decide, like it really comes down to like in the algorithm of thinking, what do you weigh more heavily? Is it legacy? Is it personal attachment? And I think that you should probably err on the side of less subjective, which is totally hypocritical to how I handled my last episode with Chris. But in this case, I'm going to go the other direction. I personally like Contra 3 more, but I think the legacy of Mortal Kombat is, if it was any other fighting game, but like Mortal Kombat it's ubiquitous with American culture, at least. Like everybody knows it. It's huge. Like you said, there's multiple movies, there's comic books, there's how many games? 14, 15 games in the series now. There's offshoots. It's, even though I like Contra 3 more, the legacy is so massive. I don't see how you can discount that. And I just has to go to Mortal Kombat. I mean, it didn't redefine fighting games, but it is like if you would write a history book about fighting games, Mortal Kombat would have a lot of pages. And fighting games.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So I just feel like the legacy is such a mammoth, such a beast that it overpowers all the other categories. So I'm going to go with Mortal Kombat.
All right. So we are at a dead heat. We are tied 1 for 1.
It's up to you, Shane.
I'm gonna be honest. I kind of hoped this was going to happen. I'm not even gonna lie. Like, listen, having clean sweeps is always interesting or whatever, but when it comes down to a vote, that's the secret sauce right there. So I was talking to Chris and Tiger actually about this sort of off mic sort of that in preparation for this episode, because I have such a strong connection to one of these two games, I wanted to make sure that I put down all of my thoughts in writing. And I don't typically do this for these King of Games episodes. I'll be honest. I usually just kind of wing it at the end and kind of pontificate about some shit. And that's also why sometimes I'll have a swing in my decision at the last minute. It has happened. But this one was, to me, very important. And so I wanted to make sure that what my thought process was very clear. So having said that, I'm going to go into my final verdict here. So while I think that many folks would consider this matchup to be a foregone conclusion in Mortal Kombat's favor, which I think possibly all three of us might have thought at one time or another, I really wanted to take that moment to truly examine both of these games when they're juxtaposed to one another in this tournament-style context, right? Mortal Kombat is undeniably a significant milestone in the history of video games. Its role in the industry avoiding government regulation and self-policing via the ESRB can't really be understated. We've brought it up a number of times. Had this not occurred, I think the gaming landscape would have been a very different place. It's also worth reiterating that the use of the digitized sprites of actual actors, though not the first time, it was still pretty novel and also fairly impressive for 1992, particularly in how they implemented it. However, I've never, and it's not just for this episode, it's most of my life, I've never been able to shake this sense that in terms of the actual gameplay experience, Mortal Kombat has always been somewhat overrated. And by this, I mean that I've always felt that folks tend to conflate the game's ubiquity and their personal experiences in arcades with the game's quality. Now, I know that this is possibly a little bit of like a spicy take or whatever, but I truly believe that if you were to completely divorce Mortal Kombat from its over-the-top violence and the sensationalism that it caused, you are ultimately left with what is at best an above average 2D fighting game. So to this point, because I want to sort of reinforce this with some actual evidence, the owner of a fairly large chain of arcades was interviewed back in '92 when MK was released. And he said that he didn't feel comfortable with the game's level of violence, so sometime after the game was made available in their establishments, they decided to tweak the boards and completely remove fatalities. So instead of being gruesomely murdered on screen, the defeated character would just disappear. They just blink off the screen. This one change caused their MK cabinet revenue to drop by roughly 40%. Whoa. So this, in and of itself, I think, is a perfect illustration of why I honestly think that without the blood and without the fatalities, no one would have given a shit about Mortal Kombat. And so, turning to Contra 3, what do we have there? Arguably, it's the pinnacle of a series. It's a showcase of what the Super Nintendo hardware is capable of, and it's an all-around challenging, bombastic, and honestly just a plain fun run-and-gun experience. Now, obviously, my personal bias is not to be ignored here. I've made no bones about that. But let's just make a quick comparison here for the sake of, hopefully, a bit more objectivity. Okay, so while Mortal Kombat was technically impressive as an arcade game, with the benefit of the superior hardware that came along with being a cabinet, Contra 3 created a visually stunning, action-packed experience to rival any arcade machine in the home and on inferior hardware. So, with all of that being said, if we're ultimately trying to determine here which games are the best of 1992, I have to give this to Contra 3 because it's capable of standing on its own as a solid gameplay experience without needing to be propped up by gimmicks or media sensationalism. And that's why I'm going to pick Contra 3.
Holy shit. Well, you guys can deal with all the feedback because it's not my podcast.
And we suddenly lost hundreds of listeners.
Shane. I said this earlier. The game is awful.
What?
Honestly speaking, Mortal Kombat is an awful game. But I'm agreeing with you. Like if it wasn't for the gimmicks, it wouldn't have been very much. Other than the characters and the way that they digitize the moves and all that probably would have been its biggest. But then in that case, Pit Fighter would have been good too.
You're also forgetting though that Mortal Kombat created like this world and lore and story that a lot of other fighting games haven't. I mean, Street Fighter kind of did, but I mean, the Mortal Kombat lore is, I don't know. Maybe I just watched that original 1998. The movie came out, Mortal Kombat 1. I can't remember what year it was, but
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was all right.
You all made good points, but the legacy of Mortal Kombat is like, it's all time. It's like,
oh, I agree.
Oh yeah, I don't think any of us disagree at all on that point.
I guess you
it's
just don't
that,
weigh it that heavy.
No,
right? Because
game sucks.
And that's the thing is like I've even gone in that direction with some decisions before in this tournament even, but especially in the King of Games 2000 as well, where a lot of what ultimately made my decision was the legacy of the game. But in this case, I just, like I said, I never could shake that sense that Mortal Kombat was not as good as everybody thought it was if you removed all of the over-the-top violence and the fatalities. You are left with a technically just okay fighting game.
I want to add in that I kind of had a little test of time here, and Contra 3 holds up so well.
Oh, absolutely.
Like,
It does hold up better. There's no doubt about it.
Just going back. But like, as I was trying to play through both of these games, like I went to this Mortal Kombat game. I was like, oh yeah, this is how this game was. That's kind of that's the feeling I got. And I was like, oh no, like, why is this even a competition? That's kind of how I felt, so that's what Mortal Kombat had going for it though. Like it's what holds it up is that it made such an impact, and that's why it's in this competition, because of how much power it has, the name itself has. Yeah. But if we're talking games.
All right, so there you have it. I'm gonna wait and see the fallout from this decision. The fact that Mortal Kombat got dropped in this tournament in the first round is fucking wild, but I'm here for it. Now, whether or not Contra 3 moves on past the second bracket, that remains to be seen, because there is some very stiff competition in the year of 1992. But just personally, I am thrilled to see it actually move on. I was coming into this episode expecting to be heartbroken, but Tiger, you saved the day.
Lucky that you picked me for this podcast.
All right. Well, first and foremost, thank you to you both for being here and participating in this tournament. These are always a really good time, and I always enjoy talking with you both. So thank you.
No worries.
And as far as what y'all do, I mean, I could throw it over to Tiger. I feel like I know what he's going to say, where he's just basically like, I have a Twitter. And that's probably it. But I'll give you an option to do that anyway. But Cade, you've got some stuff that you do maybe occasionally on the internet. What is it you do? Where can people find that?
I have a podcast called the Gaming Memories Podcast, where I interview people, get to know them by asking them about the games they grew up playing and that impacted them. Usually artists, musicians, other podcasters, actors. I've even had engineers, just people. I get to know people, and I break the ice by talking about video games. It's pretty casual. Sometimes the entire episode is about video games, and sometimes it's 5 minutes of video games and 90 minutes of aliens. So you never know what you're going to get. And then I have a new music project, Slave, Slaev, that has been launched the last few months, and it's doing really well. So you can find that project anywhere on the socials, Slaev.
Awesome. That's fantastic. All right, and Tiger, do you have a Twitter?
You can find me on my Twitter at LPTYGER. Actually, I do have another thing to share.
Ooh, all right.
Yeah, surprise, surprise. I am on a website. Okay, before we get there, if you don't know, I sell video games on Amazon and eBay, blah, blah, blah. But I also sell video games on this newer platform called Whatnot. And if you've never heard of Whatnot, it's kind of like Twitch has a baby with eBay, and you stream on Whatnot, and you stream like whatever you're selling. So I actually have been selling retro games mostly on this app. And you basically, like, for example, I have Super Mario World cartridge only. It's beautiful. I'll start the bidding at $5, and then like a minute timer comes up, and you can actually bid on the actual product, and when it's over, whoever has the highest bid wins, and they'll get it shipped to them. That's Whatnot, and I have a profile on there, so I would love you guys to follow that profile. Whatnot.com/user/LPTYGER. I am LP Tiger on Whatnot as well. So, if you guys would like to follow me there and have any curiosities about what I sell when I am streaming, then definitely add me there.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, I was surprised. I thought you had more to go for there. That's cool. I've actually never heard of that, so I'll have to check that out. That's kind of an interesting concept.
It's very cool.
All right. And as far as we're concerned, if you're listening to this, then, well, first of all, you may very well already be a patron, because that's where this is going to come out first, if I'm not mistaken. That's usually what we do. So, hi, we appreciate you supporting the show. You're fantastic. We love you. If you happen to be listening to this on the main feed, then it's a little bit later, and you could have heard this much, much sooner if you also were a patron. So if that's something that interests you, then you can head to our Linktree, which is just Linktree/Retro and you can check out all of the destinations, including our Patreon, and sign up there. And of course, we'd be forever grateful. But yeah, that's pretty much the pitch. If you're listening to this, you might already know us, so I'm not going to bore you with a lot of the details. We do that in the main episode, so keep an eye out for that, I guess. But with all of that being said, we are going to wrap this one up. So Contra will be moving on to the next bracket of the King of Games 1992 tournament, and we hope to see you there.